Hey, everybody. It's great to see everyone today. Today, I'm going to be your host, and our guest is Victor Riddel. He's going to tell you a little bit more about himself, although we know that you all know him. But I'm going to give him a little bit of an intro. Besides being the self-proclaimed greatest Jedi of them all, he's a game designer here at Meta. He's also worked on a few worlds, like the first one that was used at Connect back in 2022, Questies, Crash Site, and Rooftop 42. So really excited to have him. Please give him all sorts of love in chat and all that. So we have a very simple agenda today. I'm going to finish this introduction and then I'm going to hand it over to Victor. As I mentioned in Discord yesterday, this session is going to be a little bit different. What we've heard from you all is that you are all looking at ways to become better creators, how to improve, that craft of being a creator and building worlds. This session is the start of trying to do that and starting to tackle some of those topics. Gameplay loops are an important part of world building, and we know that you all know like the basics of how to create a loop. What Victor's going to be doing today is going to go deeper into them, getting a little bit nerdy with it, and hopefully give you all enough to think about so that you're able to explore this topic more deeply afterwards. Now, a couple bits of logistics before I hand this over to Victor. First, everyone here is under NDA. We may talk about things that would be protected by that agreement. So please, we know you do this, continue to honor your NDAs. So with that, let me hand it over to Victor and he can take it away.
Hey everyone. First, I just want to say how delighted I was when Jeremy reached out and said, would I like to do a talk for the NHCP community around game design. So it's just delightful to be here. But I think I'll just start with just giving you all a little bit about my game development history. It's like the mid-90s, and I think, okay, I've studied art and I've been an obsessive gamer my whole life. So I decided to move into the games industry. So I started on a couple of sports games, actually, at a company in the UK called Creative Assembly that went on to do the Rome Total War games, Alien Isolation, and things like that. But honestly, I got a little bit frustrated working on sports games. They weren't necessarily my first choice, and an opportunity came up with a studio in London called Computer Artworks, where I went to work on an absolutely crazy squad-based game called Evolver. It was like you're an alien on an alien planet running around with three other aliens and you command them, and it was multiplayer and single player and stuff. But that was actually relatively successful. So I started there way back then, you did a little bit of everything. So I was doing concept art, level design, world building, multiplayer design, actually building and rigging the characters and animating them as well. So that was relatively successful, as I mentioned. And then Universal Studios reached out because they had the rights to do an old film, a John Carpenter film called The Thing. If you're old enough to know it, it's quite scary, an amazing example of practical effects back then. So I worked as the lead designer, creative director on that game, but also did a lot of level design in that. And that worked it was an NPC game, and they had a kind of really interesting AI model where they had a trust and fear of the player. And that was really successful again. So EA took notice and they asked me to join EA UK. So I was with them for a number of years. I worked on it was kind of a Pokemon style game with a battle system where you were dancing. It was quite weird, but that was the height of the Nintendo DS era. Also had the joy of working with Hasbro. So I managed to go out there and saw their toy labs where they invent toys, which just blew my mind, actually. I also worked on the Harry Potter games, most notably the Goblet of Fire. I'm a little bit of a Harry Potter fan, so Mavics, if you're doing the Harry Potter trivia night, again, please make it Euro-friendly time zone. I'll be there. And then I decided to go over to Europe to work in Europe, so leave the UK. And then I worked with a company called Guerrilla Games, went on to make Horizon Zero Dawn. And I worked on Killzone 2 and Killzone 3 franchise. And then a friend of mine decided to set up a studio called Supermassive Games. If you know them, they did Until Dawn, very successful kind of narrative studio. But they were also playing around with augmented reality games. So if you remember PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, you had PlayStation Eye, which was quite a, low resolution camera, but we managed to extract some real fun out of that technology. But then something really interesting happened in my career. So this kind of represents the first 10 years of my creative direction and game direction career. I decided to join an emerging technology company. And they were in Europe, they were in Belgium, actually in Brussels. And they were doing the craziest stuff. It's probably the most fun I've had in my career since I was a professional gamer before I joined the games industry. And they were doing crazy stuff like digital signage and interactive projection and 3D printing and hand tracking and full body tracking. And they were also doing augmented reality, which I was also a fan of at the time, but oh my days, there it was. 2014, somebody brought in a black box and inside it was Oculus DK1. Yeah, and this was the first Oculus headset. And I will never forget my first experience of that because it was one of those light bulb moments where I thought, okay, the potential of this technology is off the scale. I'm all in. So I decided to pivot my career entirely into VR game development. Okay, so I joined a dedicated VR game studio in Amsterdam, which I'm living in Amsterdam currently, called Force Field, who went on to be renamed as Vertigo Games, who did the Arizona Sunshine games. So this was very early on, and this represents kind of 10 years of me working in VR games. So initially I did a Gear VR, if you know that headset, a game called Terminal, which was like a Metal Gear Solid game. Then we went on to do Gear VR and Oculus Go, which was the first kind of standalone headset that didn't require a phone to be slotted into it. A pet nurturing game called Pet Lab. I then went on to make a best described as an action coaster game on Gear VR and Oculus Go called Coaster Combat. Then was lucky enough to work with National Geographic on it's like a kayaking experience, which worked really well in VR actually with the motion controllers. You did ice climbing and also explored Machu Picchu. Then went on to make a physics puzzle game, which had time manipulation called Time Stall, and that was Oculus Quest, so you could actually walk around. So it was a really kind of embraced untethered gameplay. And then got talking to Ubisoft, who were kicking off the initiative to create Assassin's Creed actually in VR. So I joined the studio in Dusseldorf and worked on a recently released Assassin's Creed Nexus as a game director. There was a problem though. In the day, I'm working on Assassin's Creed. This is lockdown. It's 2020, so I'm dealing with my team in the day. But I've been invited to try something called Horizon Worlds. And this was like version 14. It was super janky. It was boxes, nothing worked. There was no snapping. It was like super early, but I absolutely fell in love with it. So I was doing game director duties at Ubisoft in the day. And at night, I was building worlds and on my weekends as well. Well, maybe some of you know, I way back then, I built a lot of worlds that Meta took notice in. So then I got talking to Meta and I've been there for the last 3 years as a game designer on the Horizon Worlds team. Before I get into talking about gameplay loops, I did want to talk about the kind of the different aspects that we engage as game designers. But I did want to say there is no perfect kind of game design methodology that you could follow or game design process where if you employ that, you're going to get a great game out of the end of it. So I tend to think about, game designers and the designers on my team having a toolbox. So, it might be, as I say, mechanics design or systems design, or one of my favorite, which is narrative design. Level design, which I think is very appropriate to Horizon Worlds. Also, landing players in your world, how to give them a good sense of what you want them to do or how your game features work, which is the onboarding and tutorialization. There's also player psychology. It's more of a more recent topic in game design that we've been talking about, which is much more about, self-determination theory and intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, which I'll talk a little bit about later. There's prototyping methodologies. This is really just best practices stuff. Good playtesting procedures, and the difference between focus testing and playtesting is something, that is very interesting to the design team and the wider team as well. There's also the very specific design challenges of spatial interaction, reaching out, grabbing things and manipulating objects in a virtual environment, and also comfort design that is a new area of design that we've had to look at very seriously in VR development. But which leads us on to the topic of today, which is gameplay loops. Gameplay loops could be described as just repetitive actions that the player does a lot, and they could increase in skill or learning, or, there are kind of abilities within that world. But it's really just a method for designers to kind of have conversations about different aspects of the gameplay experience we're trying to build. And these can be different sizes. So, I tend to think about, what is the player doing second to second being the primary gameplay loop? What is the player's consideration minute to minute, and how does the second feed into that? And also, session lengths like hour to hour. Now, you can't necessarily apply gameplay loops to all game types. So, I use the example of, a complex strategy game on PC or something like that. So you don't necessarily have a second to second. So your initial loop may last minutes before you reach the kind of point of conclusion through player action. So I do want to talk about Daniel Cook's, the way that he describes gameplay loops or core loops, things like that. And he's a really wonderful designer. I'd encourage you to, if you're interested in these kind of subjects, there's a load of, he's done a load of GDC talks, stuff like that. Okay, so what Daniel talks about is the abstraction of a loop is really, it starts at the top. So the player has a mental model of, the world that they land in, or the scenario that's presented in front of them, right? And this may come from familiarity with the genre. It could be, I'm playing a first-person shooter, so it's quite likely that the right stick, I'm going to look around, left stick, I'm going to move, right trigger, fire, left trigger, secondary fire, things like that. So familiarity. It could be a third-person game, so you might think, similarly, these are the kind of things that I understand, right? And then what the player does is they perform some kind of action, right? So it's kind of, test out, the things that are presented in front of them, whatever. And then you as game creators, you create the rules for that world, right? And you also give the player feedback, has the action done something positive, or that could be like a positive sound effect, or is it a negative sound effect? So you could apply his model to, again, like, different scales. I'll talk about jump. So let's imagine you land in, a game where you're a character. So your sense might be, okay, so, I'll press the button. So, the character does a jump, right? The rules of that might be that, there's different gravity or things like that. So you'll see feedback, the character will go really high. It might be that you tap the button versus hold it for a long time. So it does more of a jump. So every time the player does these things, they're updating their understanding of the world. And some designers say that through a loop, a player should like increase in skill or get better at something or learn something. And that's certainly true. Okay, so I just want to talk about the kind of the second to second primary gameplay loops and give the example of Mario, Minecraft and Super Rumble. So I think what's really important to design teams when they're thinking about the second to second action is, the kind of, it needs to be immediately understandable. We need to give really, really clear player feedback. Teams often spend a ton of time just refining the quality of that interaction, because this might be something the player does, over tens of hours, but it's all the time. It's repeatable, right? And again, as I mentioned before, it's always nice and compelling for players if there's some kind of skill development over time. So I'll use the example of my favorite Mario, which is Super Mario 3D World. Absolutely adore this game, play it a lot with my daughter. So the player, they move. Okay, so I'm moving, around the level. Oh, I can jump, right? And then there's basically, do I decide to jump on this enemy? Do I just avoid it? And then I'll do some moves. So they're going through that loop quite a lot. And I do know that when, Nintendo decided to build Mario 64 way back, they literally spent 2 or 3 months just on that loop before they even considered all the gameplay entities that they wanted in the world that would kind of create variety. Okay, for Minecraft, if you played it, I hope you played it. It's what I would consider one of the greatest games of all time. So I explore, I avoid hazards. I don't fall off chasms. I don't step in lava. I action things, attack them, chop them. And you have these kind of really nice, satisfying kind of sounds as things, kind of drop in front of you. You pick them up and there's a little popping sound. And then I just continue to gather and explore. So that loop in itself, had to be, really easy to understand, as I say on the left, high quality interaction design, and there's some kind of skill development and at least learning, that just punching a tree with your hand is not necessarily the best strategy. Okay, Super Rumble. So I hope you've played it. I think it's a wonderful piece of software created by one of the internal teams. So, we could say that I'm moving and jumping and I'm shooting and reloading just as a real a basic loop. Of course, there are other loops going on, whether it's, exploring, parkour, skill development, things like that. But just, moving and jumping, there's a consideration to the quality of that. Now, I know we have default jump systems within on the platform, but, it was deliberate. They didn't want a sprint functionality in there because of player fatigue and, ease of use and things like that. So that was a consideration. Shooting is insanely high quality. It's like just the feedback that you get from pressing the button, the sound effect that fires off, the recoil of the weapon, the animation, the VFX, even with reload, the quality of that sequence is so nice. It really supports the idea of the players just doing this all of the time, repeatedly. Okay, so for the secondary gameplay loops, these could be considered the midterm goals. I'm doing these primary loops all the time. And the secondary loops is kind of what am I working towards with all these, actions as I'm developing my skill and understanding of the world. So it's also important to think about, if you're thinking about the secondary loops, what's the reward or the sense of completion, or what are we actually giving the player? What's the carrot that we're dangling in front of them? Okay, so in Super Mario World, you might be collecting power-ups. That might just be enough for you to kind of use the skill that you've learned within the moment-to-moment interactions of jumping on boxes and killing enemies to get your power-ups and get to the end of the level. And this is really the goal with something like Mario. You might take a kind of a loop outside of that secondary loop where it's motivating to you to find discoveries or secrets. So in the Minecraft example, I get to craft new items. This is a draw for me as I'm exploring that world, and it's intriguing what I can do with all of these materials. But interestingly, I'm crafting new items. It allows me to collect new materials. So we're expanding the loop again. I can build new things with the new materials, and then that enables me to explore more. It might mean that I now have diamond armor and a diamond pickaxe or whatever, so I can go into the deeper depths and I can kind of farm things more meaningful. Okay, in terms of Super Rumble, I'm collecting different weapons as part of my secondary loop. Right? But I'm also have all the special abilities, and they've even got their own XP loop as you need to unlock as you spend time in that world. I'm getting kills, I'm being killed, I'm kind of working on my skill as a player, and eventually I'm winning or losing matches. So I'm going through those kind of loops to support my kind of growth in that experience. Okay, tertiary loops, these can be considered as like progression loops. Some designers would call these more of a kind of a player progression system that kind of holds the previous loops kind of in place. It's interesting to think about scoring and rewards structures, even as a simple game. Just giving score and that rising up a leaderboard can be enough for a tertiary loop or a progression loop. Player progression and mastery is a really interesting one, because this is, I think, what separates good games from really, really great games. It's where players can be in your game. They can go through a session and then they can step out, but it's still on their mind. What if I go back and use that different gun? Or what if I kind of, speed run so I can do this? Or what if I search these areas or pay more attention to a certain aspect? So I think if you leave your player really thinking about what are the things I can do differently, or what are the things that, I need to experience to get better at your game, then they're much more likely to kind of return as they kind of travel across the mastery curve, as we sometimes refer to it. And again, reasons to return. So reasons to return could be, I've got unfinished business. I want to climb up the leaderboard. I want to unlock all the quest rewards or things like that. So for the Super Mario 3D world example, so if I'm on a world section, because there are multiple within this game, to enable me to take on the kind of the key objective of that section, which is to defeat the boss, I need to collect a number of different stars that allows me to unlock the opportunity to kind of finish that level. So, I'm possibly going back into the world to get those bonus stars on the level, and then I can defeat the boss, and then I can move on to new world areas. Okay, Minecraft. This is fascinating, and it was for many game designers looking at the success of Minecraft in the early days. So there's a really interesting aspect that we talk about. It's the player psychology, which is intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. So an extrinsic motivation would be, the game tells you to do X, so you just do it. So you're kind of, you're acting on the demands of the game or the structure of the game, right? Intrinsic motivation is doing something just because you love it. It might be the jumping is so great in a platform game that you just love to jump around and kind of build on your skill. Additionally, extrinsic motivation is more around the principle that a goal that you set for yourself is always more compelling or more rewarding than a goal that is set externally by the game or by someone else. So, in Minecraft, if you played it, you might get to that point where you think, oh, what should I do next? So you think, okay, I'm going to build a citadel with a farm on the top or something like this. And I got stuck in it for hundreds of hours, and it was just a wonderful thing. Super Rumble for the tertiary loop or the progression loop, it could just be playing matches to earn XP, so I can get my new rank. I can get that, the name above my, on the leaderboard when I kind of step in. And again, it could be rising up the leaderboard. So it's that kind of the piece that kind of holds it all together.
Thank you, Victor. I mean, that was, primary, secondary, tertiary loops within loops, the detail that you go into. And I appreciate that you had the same games for each one to really express how these build upon themselves and the additional thought that really goes into building these worlds, as the game designers for those really went to address what is the game loop, what is going to be fun and interactive, how do we teach people what is what they can do within the worlds and all of that. So I appreciate that. Looks like we're getting some appreciation as well within chat as well. So we'll go into a couple of the Q&As that were submitted ahead of time so that we can talk a little bit more on some additional parts of it. This first question, how do you measure the effectiveness of each loop in user testing and feedback?
This is really the assumption versus reality scenario where you as a creator, when you're building your games, before you release them to Horizon and before you play test them, you have an assumption of how the player is going to react to the things that you're building or the things that you want them to do. So, if you're considering loops within that, okay, I want my players to do second to second, not get bored with it, have some sense of skill development, have some sense of kind of growth or mastery within that. I think when you get into testing, that could just be one of the things that you're observing. So you could say, okay, I'm going to focus in testing on the second to second, and I would always recommend you do observational testing with your play testing. But this is, maybe a subject I talked about earlier that probably worthy of it, 45 minutes and stuff. And it's similar to, your secondary loops or your midterm goals. It's like, is you should be questioning, is the interaction understandable? Is it high quality? Am I giving good positive feedback, through sound effects or VFX or, pop-up text or however you want to do it? Am I doing it equally if the player is doing something that shouldn't be working well? So I'm giving them little negative sound effects or helping them understand that kind of stuff. For the tertiary loops, I think it's a harder one to prove or disprove in a playtesting scenario, because we're talking about hour-to-hour activity. So it's absolutely up to you. If you guys have got time to kind of sit around for hours on end watching your players running around your world and stuff, just to get a real sense of how they're engaging and are they motivated to come back. Do they want to rise up the leaderboard? Do they want that status? Do they want the unlocks? Do they want to discover more and stuff? So I think that's generally, this is less of a consideration for your loops. Just understand your loops. What do you want them to do in those different scaled loops, and just be observational and confirm or deny your assumption around your game design.
I appreciate that, and yeah, that being able to confirm that from the second to second and minute to minute, thinking about it is really impactful. Let's go on to the next question. And I think this one's pretty relevant for lots of folks in the chat, because we're creators, right? There's more than just games, and there's different types of worlds that we like to build and communities that we like to build. So can I apply gameplay loops to worlds that aren't games? How should we be thinking about that as we're thinking about our target audience and what we want them to do? I know we've talked a little bit about like gameplay loops are also a way to talk through how someone should act within a world, which may be applicable here.
When I first saw this question, I was like, oh, maybe it doesn't. But then I kind of thought about it, and I think I would go back to kind of Daniel Cook's kind of loop of learning or loop of awareness, or the considerations you would have with any repeat action. So I think it could be what do you want the player to understand really quickly when they kind of enter that world? It could be, okay, so this world, it's, we've got our rules that we're kind of establishing, or behavioral suggestions or things like that. But it could be that you just want some interaction or some activity within that. So I'll use the example of a social space. So again, it's the consideration of what's the player's kind of understanding of their mental model of this space. I'll give the example of the chuckle nuggets in Soapstone, because I think there's something quite interesting about that. So it's like, okay, so there's a chicken. Okay, so I approach the chicken and it runs away, and if I continue to do with it, then it pops out an egg, and then okay, so I have this egg and I don't really understand what it is. And then, I'm kind of going through that kind of understanding what that is. And yeah, I think it does the kind of the comprehension and the kind of learning part of loops is definitely appropriate to non-games.
Can you share an example of a 3P world that's non-meta, non-2P that you think integrates all three of these loops exceptionally well?
I think the one that immediately came to mind was Samurai Tycoon. And I think, Immortal, the King of Sandbox, I think he's done really well with the primary loop, the second to second interaction. So I just think, chopping that bamboo, it's definitely got the consideration. So in terms of the interaction quality, there's like there's a slight sway to that sword. The object handling again is really nice. There's a little VFX that fires off, when I hit the object, and I get a little sound as well. So it's tightly integrated enough. So there's, when I played that, I thought, okay, yeah, there's definitely a kind of quality interaction in the second to second. In terms of the secondary loop, I think, just the establishment that I can unlock areas, and there's a couple of loops kicking off at this point. I've got a kind of a gold economy loop, and I've got an XP gathering loop as well. So that, that's definitely interesting. And it's perfectly descriptive of the midterm goals that I was talking about. It's going, I'm chopping stuff, and there's bamboo, and right behind me, it's very obvious to me. There's a padlock on there. It's really easy to understand. I can go through the comprehension loop on product, what that does, X amount of XP. So I've got my midterm goals there, but I've also got parallel midterm goals of acquiring swords and things like that. The tertiary loop, or the major progression loop, I didn't fully understand when I was in that world, so I spent some time with some utterly delightful 10-year-olds who kind of helped me understand what the kind of the end game or the longer term goals, apart from gathering all the swords. And I was made aware of this little tiny cloud section right at the back. So again, very obvious, very inviting. So, I think that's a really, that was the one that immediately came to mind, when I saw this question. I've got a lot of love for Sandwich, so I think the Action Land, Pirates and Farms one, again, it's just got all those pieces that I was talking about. So in the second to second, there's really nice recoil on the gun. It's got that animation. It's got the sound triggering, really nicely. It's well tuned. It's got the VFX firing off. Even the trace, the bullet impact, when it hits the wall. So again, I've got that really nice kind of comprehensible, high quality interaction that I'm doing second to second. On the minute to minute, again, I've got the weapon unlock system. I've got the other loops of, I want to experiment with all the other guns. I want to try them out. I want to learn about them and stuff. So I can kind of, go through my kind of midterm activities, and that's very rewarding. And for the progression loops, the tertiaries, it's all ranking and leaderboards and status and unlocks and things like that. So I think that's the other one that I referenced. Sorry to use a very obvious one there and stuff. But like I said, please point me in the direction of other games that you think do that well.
I think that's great, and I think you'll probably get a lot of comments on it. One thing I noticed, and maybe we talk about this later because I do want to get to some of the questions that have been asked in chat. What I'm noticing, especially on the second to second loops, you're really talking about the experience there in terms of the VFX, the sound, the way that things work and feel, even more than and like the secondary and tertiary. And I think that attention to detail is something that you're calling out without even explicitly calling it out. Is that just me, or is that part of it?
This is when I worked along the Battlefield team at EA, they coined the phrase of of gun feel, gun handling. Some of the team referred to it as the through the gun experience. And what they really helped me understand was, it's not just about how good your gun mechanics are or your weapon handling. It's everything that surrounds it that works together to build something that's perceived as being high quality. So it was like, it literally everything, the way it reacted if you moved it around with secondary animations, the recoil, and just tying all the visual effects and the sound effects and all of that stuff. So and again, that was enforced when I was working on the Killzone franchise out at Gorilla. It's similar. It was just the insane amount of quality that went into just pulling the trigger and seeing the result in the world. That was where I learned the importance of the kind of high quality interaction and player feedback in second to second.
The next question is, what external tools, if any, would you recommend for planning and keeping track of gameplay loops in Horizon Worlds?
Honestly, it could be anything. I use like Notepad, really. So I think it's, for me, it would always be a sense of, if I'm coming up with a concept, say, for example, I want to pitch internally, or I'm discussing with a game designer, it would always be, you know, um, let's think about what the player does most often. You know, what are your competitive references here? What are other titles that do this really, really well? You know, similarly for the minute to minute and the hour to hour, it's like, you know, those kind of questions. So I just use Notepad, Word doc, this kind of thing. And I think this was born out of, you know, having junior designers come on my team and they're saying, I've got this amazing game idea. And they would say, you know, okay, it's this and it's this story of these characters. And I said, but this is all character design and story. So go away, have a little think about, you know, what are all the second to second activities? And we sometimes refer to them as verbs, and the minute to minute and hour to hour, as I mentioned. So yeah, just documents or even your notepad. Why not?
Curious how traditional game loops translate into VR with all the spatial differences. I think this is really interesting, right? We work in a world, we're working in a medium that's even more immersive. And this is clearly asking like what are, you know, some of the how does it translate?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question, and this is more a kind of a question of gameplay and the unique considerations for you know VR design. Um, so I think obviously there's comfort. That's one part of it. It's you know you want to hit as many users as possible, and as I mentioned earlier, that's probably an entire 45-minute talk just on designing for comfort. I think additionally, you've got 3 points in space. You know, you've got your controllers, you've got your headset, but this means that in VR, you can do things differently in traditional flat screen games. So it could be simultaneous two-handed interactions. You know, I could be holding an object and manipulating it, and somehow those interactions feel really good. It could be dual wielding, um, uh, things like that. So this does cause a little bit of a problem, actually, and I'm going a little bit off topic here, but I will do around designing for cross screens or considering cross screens and spatial design for VR, because what makes game design really interesting for VR with having simultaneous two-handed interactions and stuff, that it translates terribly to cross screens. So having a touchscreen virtual joypad input versus mouse and keyboard or things like that, having those things kind of work really well. So that's the whole considerations for VR design versus a specifically kind of PC mouse and keyboard design versus virtual keyboard touchscreen interaction design and stuff. That's probably a whole nother talk. So I don't know if I can answer that.
No, but what I'm hearing from you, if I can summarize, is that gameplay loops as a theory are still really important, especially in this primary, secondary, tertiary level. The tools that you as a creator have to implement it, knowing the medium of where the user is going to be, might change how you're implementing it, but overall gameplay loops do translate pretty succinctly to VR. Is that
Yeah.
right? Or
Yeah, and I think it definitely transfers and stuff. But I think in the second to second, if your primary interactions or the things that you want the player to do all the time are two-handed interactions, then I think that is very specific to how do you do that? How do you give that variety? How do you make players kind of learn and want to come back and do it more and more stuff? So
that helps us with going on to the next question. Do you feel it's necessary to have instructions at spawn, or can you have a world that intuitively can be discovered and learned? Many
oh,
kids don't necessarily read them, and I think we talked a little bit about it, how loops can help people do that. But it looks like we want to get a little deeper on this one.
I love this question. This is, I've had many hour-long conversations about this, and again, it could warrant another easily 30 minutes talking about, design methodologies for good, competent onboarding, and how to prioritize tutorialization for looking at all your major features and your support features and which ones are important to teach at the moment of landing and stuff like that. I will say that I learned very early on in my kind of Horizon world building career that people don't like to read. They just don't. They just, honestly, if you put instruction on in the landing area or the staging area, the onboarding area, players just run past it. Now, I think that if you really want to use signage um, in your kind of arrival area, then try and think about diagrammatical because you know users can absorb visual information so much more quickly. So I think is it? Oh God, what's the coaching game where you run around and there's ghosts? There's Monster High or something. I think they did some pictorial, descriptive stuff or video or stuff that works super well and stuff. So yeah, that's one consideration. That users, especially a younger audience, as somebody mentioned in the question, are a bit kind of paragraph blind. So if you've got a couple of key statements that you want to make about your mechanics or the experience in your world, call it out. Great. Just make it simple. Use 5 or 6 words. People will absorb that and they'll move on and they'll get to what's most interesting. Another consideration is staging of that environment. So if you stage that environment, you've got a notice board on your left and a notice board on your right, but then you've got this amazing gold glowing door with this wonderful activity behind it. Compositionally, this doorway will be competing with this information. So you're reducing the chances of people even taking interest in that or reading it and stuff. So they'll just go forward to the most interesting thing. Another part is something in design we talk about, which is design immediacy. So if there's something very familiar about the object that you want players to interact with, or the thing that you want them to do, or the game type that should be kind of familiar to them, you don't necessarily need to worry so much about onboarding instruction. So players can land and they go, this thing over here, I think if I grab it and I press the big red button on it, then, the hatch is going to open or something's going to pop out. I don't know where I'm going with this, by the way. But consider how obvious or immediate that object in your world is, or the interaction that you want them to do, if you don't want to do like tons of text, which, as we know, people don't like to read. Or if you do have a lot of text, put it in a calming environment and make it the most interesting thing in that scene, and then you're more likely that users are going to absorb it.
I think this falls really nicely into the next question. During the ideation phase, what steps do you usually start to consider and really dive into gameplay loops?
Oh, ideation. So again, it's like I said with the earlier slide, there is no kind of one magic game design process, game design methodology that's going to output a great game at the end of it. And players can come from many different, or game creators can come from many different directions from this. So your primary objective in ideation might be that I just want a big old world for people to explore. You start there, and then you kind of hone into, wouldn't it be nice if there was some smaller interactions within the world that players could engage with, and you kind of start to build those in where they feel appropriate. Other times, and this is what we tend to favor in the games industry, which is, show me a really super compelling interaction that supports your high level pitch. It might be, I use the example, Assassin's Creed, right? I want to show me some stealth. Show me you stealthily moving around this environment and stuff that's going to, give me a good sense that your larger plan for this, $50 million game is going to work in the moment. And then you're into, okay, as I'm sneaking around, how much noise do I make? What's the feedback? Where do I get directional feedback for the guards or whatever? So, you could think about that loop in the sense of how it supports the larger concept. But I think ideation is just, it's just one of those things you have to consider. I've had many designers come to me and say, I've got this great concept about this giant turtle, but he's also a mountain and stuff. And as I said before, it's like, okay, help me understand not only what I would be doing in the moment, but why I would want to come back, why I'd want to play more, why, what am I learning? What's the variety over time and things like that. So yeah, it's always something you have to answer as a creator at some point. what is the player going to be doing and how I'm going to make that high quality and compelling.
I appreciate that. I think that falls into the next question as well, which is very similar in terms of world building. The question is, given like the unique nature of how designing is done in Horizon, is, this is more a personal question, I think, for you, but do you find it easier to gray box everything and plan it before designing or, doing the gameplay looping of the entire world, or do you design and brainstorm as you go? The question says, what do you suggest works best for Horizon World platform? But I think you'll probably give a personal spin onto how you do it. And I think what you sort of answer is a little bit of both, right?
Again, I think it depends. I think, we as Horizon World creators, sometimes we're kind of in ourselves a little bit, and we're kind of working on this thing, and kind of we might be with a couple of other people. So I think we can decide kind of which bits we do when. It might be really motivating for us to build out a really interesting skyline, or do something with art or lighting, or create an interactive moment that's explorative, or something like that. Gray boxing traditionally is a really, really great external communication tool. So, if I was talking to a client, say for example, when I was previously at Meta, I would describe the concept that I wanted to build, and then say, okay, we'll see you again. We have some kind of faith in that this is going to be interesting. But then as you start to build a larger team, that team needs to have a really good understanding of where to apply their creative energy, whether it's through art or animation or visual effects design or, lighting or whatever. I think what gray boxing gives you is not only proving or disproving how compelling the interaction is in the moment or over time, because you're actually in there kind of as quickly as possible, and you're doing the interactions, you're having the experience. But the larger team can go, okay, so this grey box over here is going to be some kind of Italian villa, or is it? Oh, yeah, okay, great. So grey boxing is not only a great thing for just designers or Horizon world builders or creators, just get a sense of how all the pieces fit together, but it's also really good for the larger team to understand how their work kind of fits into this. And also, if you're talking to a client, I've done this before. I've said, okay, so this grey box demo you're about to experience, so they would play it, and I'd say, is going to look like this. And you show them this amazing piece of concept art. This dusty kind of Mars landscape with all these impossible structures building out, and they start to piece it together. So I think gray boxing is a wonderful tool, not only for Horizon World creators, but also, for medium-sized teams, and even, the 2,000 person team that I was with in working on Assassin's Creed. So big fan of gray boxing. And I think Horizon is, with the older tools, it was just so quick to just go boom, 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 boom. I throw stuff down, and you invite someone into your world and just explain it, and they'll be like, I think I know what you're trying to achieve here and stuff. It takes a little bit longer with, Trimesh and the kind of workflows that we're working with today, but it's still super valuable.
We've got time for one more before we close it out, and I think this is a really good one. There's a lot of excitement around this that we're seeing just in the chat in general. This next question is, what are some tools and resources that the creators can use to learn more about things like this, especially with gameplay? Anything that you recommend?
There's kind of as a game designer, there's some best in class things. So, I forget the author. I wish I'd had this question earlier on, then I could, great. But if you're interested in just design, I'm not talking about game design or anything like that. It's called The Design of Everyday Things. It's a wonderful book about, it goes into the kind of how humans perceive how to interact with things in front of them just by the shape and the form and the visual language of those things. So just design, it's like the design of everyday things. I can't remember, I would search, but I'm not going to do that now. There's a book about fun. Now, fun is a really tricky subject to define. because one player's fun is another player's distress. I had a designer who played Mass Effect 2 all day because he loved planet scanning. I hated it. He thought it was the best thing ever, just scanning planets for hours and hours. So again, it's really hard to really nail down what fun is. But there's a game designer called Ralph Costa. He did a really fun book called The Theory of Fun. So I definitely recommend that. Daniel Cook, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a whimsical designer. I like that kind of side of design. I like design that encourages, friendship building and the collision of like-minded people and things like that. So he talks about that in his talk. So definitely, if you like that side of design, less of the more kind of nuts and bolts design, but more of the kind of whimsical and emotional design, then Daniel Cook is great. And then I'm going to reference for storytelling, Save the Cat. I think it's just one of those little books that's just really inspirational. So definitely that. And if I think of any other resources, then I'll definitely let you know on Discord.
Thank you so much. Absolutely appreciate it. We're closing up on time here, so I want to thank everybody here who took time out of their day for your time and energy and just spending some time with us. We're hoping it's really helpful, and we're really looking forward to your feedback on this one. So thank you again.